highlighting of some of the important steps you can take towards being more transparent and reproducible with our research. And we're going to focus on using an open source tool called the Open Science Framework. So we're going to talk about creating a project on the Open Science Framework to lower the barrier to transparency and study documentation. We're going to talk about how to pre-register your project, so how to create a window into the state of your project before you collected your data. We're going to talk about how to use the OSF to track the evolution of the study over time using version control and by connecting all your research services into one place, as well as how to share your materials and increase the impact of your work. So as I said before, please ask questions along the way. We're going to spend most of the time doing a highlight of just the main uses of the Open Science Framework for managing a single experiment. The Open Science Framework is a free, open source, and customizable online framework for researchers. So if you're interested in learning some more in-depth use, I'm happy to follow up with this with a deeper dive into the OSF or to point you towards resources that can help you to learn the more advanced uses of the OSF. So why we introduced the Open Science Framework in reproducibility workshops is because it allows researchers to set up a centralized location for project management. And having a centralized location allows people to document the entire research workflow. So you can see here we have an abstraction of the research workflow, all the different steps that researchers take in their effort to build knowledge. But currently, the only point of access that we have in most disciplines, including agriculture, is the published report. So these are journal articles that we share, but they don't necessarily include information on changes made to the study over time, protocol deviations, the methods, the data, and that information is necessary in order to really interpret and use someone's research. So by using the Open Science Framework, we can make it easy to manage different versions of files, to manage different research services that people in your team might be using. It makes it easy to back up and share different parts of your research. So we're going to focus on how to use the OSF for a single experiment or study. But as I mentioned before, this is only one way of using the OSF. You can use it to share your publications, to organize your lab, to organize grants and lines of research. Also, we have views of the OSF that allow you to organize materials for meetings, conferences, and institutions. And if you're interested in that, I can always follow up with you to talk about that in more detail. So let's get started with the Open Science Framework. So when you first sign up for an Open Science Framework account, which is free, something like this. This is our dashboard. This is a place where you can easily search and filter all of your different projects to make it really easy to find what you're looking for. Another way of looking through your projects is by clicking on the My Projects page. And this is a place where you can see all your projects and you can sort through them using important information such as who you're working on this project with, your fellow contributors on the project, or through tags. So the OSF makes it really easy to easily find the work that you're looking for and see the recent activity on that work. So you can make as many projects as you want on the Open Science Framework for free. To do this, you click on the Create Project button. And here you can name your project whatever you want. Since we're focusing on how to create a project for a specific experiment, today I'm going to use the example of a cropping experiment. So you can name it anything you want. I'm going to create a project for a long-term intensive cropping system field experiment. And when you create a new project, you have the option of adding a description. And this will help people to know what's inside your project if you choose to make it public, but it'll also help you to know, to remind you what is inside this project. So in this case, I'm currently copying and pasting this information in here that I've written somewhere else, but you can just type it in. So you put in anything you want in the description or title that you find useful. And then you can click Create, go to New Project, and this is what you'll see when you first create a project on the OSF. Any questions so far about how you can create a project on the OSF? So every new project that you create will look very similar at the beginning. You'll have the title at the top. You will be the only contributor on your project to begin with. There'll be some information about the project, such as when it was created and the description that you entered. And currently, you'll see that you're the only contributor and that the project is private. So every project that you make on the Open Science Framework is private unless you choose to make it public. So we don't force people to share things, but we do make it easy to share if they choose to with the click of a button. You'll notice up here we have this URL, which is a globally unique identifier, which means that this address will always resolve to this page, this project page. Though if you enter this right now, because it's private, you won't be able to access it. Every project, when it starts, will have these similar components, or parts of the project. The Wiki is a real-time collaborative text editor. This is where you can store important project information. It's all tracked using Git, which is a way of tracking changes to the text. This is called version control, which I'll talk about in more depth a little later. This is the citation widget, which is a place that will automatically create your citation based on your contributors and the GUID. So this is a prompt for the people that look at your project, if you make it public, to cite and give you credit for your work. And this is the components section. So this is where you would create structure in your project. We leave this section blank so that you can create the project that's most useful for your type of research and for your workflow. And then finally, here's a tag section that you can use to make your research more discoverable if you choose to share it, and also to make it easier for you to find your work by adding appropriate tags here. You can add whatever tags you want. You can come up with a system for your lab if you like. So right now, I'm the only person on this project. But one of the most valuable things about the Open Science Framework is that it makes it very easy to collaborate across large teams, international teams, and distributed teams. So you can do this by adding contributors to your project, and those people will then be able to view or edit your project. So to add contributors, I click on this Add button here, and then I can add people that I think should be able to make changes or view this project. So if the person has an Open Science Framework account already, their name will show up here, and it's really easy to just add them with this plus sign. If they didn't have an account already, you would have the opportunity to add them as an unregistered contributor. You would put in their name and their email address, and they would receive an email invitation to your project. But my coworker here is already on the OSF, so I can add her very easily. Well, every time you add someone to a project, you're given the option of controlling what they're able to do on the project. So for example, if the person is someone that needs to be able to read the content, view the content, and comment on the content, then you would give them read permissions. If this is a person that needs to be able to add some structure to your project by creating components and playing with the settings of those components, or add content or remove content, then you would give them read or write privileges. And this is likely sufficient privileges for most of the people that you'll add to your project. If that person is somebody that needs to be able to do very advanced work on the project, such as adding new contributors to the project, or making a project public or private, or to create a registration, then you would give them administrator status. It's important to note that administrative status not only allows them to do these things, but also allows them to remove contributors. So if you give someone administrative status, they could remove you from your project. They are also given automatic read access to any of the nested components that you create in your project. So keep that in mind when you add somebody as an administrator. So now I have Jolene and me on this project, and you'll see here that we are listed now both as contributors in the order that they're listed in the contributors tab. And now her name also shows up here in the citation widget. Any questions about adding contributors at this point? Okay. The next section I'm going to show you is the Wiki. The Wiki is a real-time collaborative text editor, and it's a very accessible way of starting to document important project information and to track the evolution of your study over time. So remember I mentioned at the beginning the whole research workflow and how important it is for reproducibility to be tracking the important information about our study over time. The Wiki makes this very easy to do. There are many uses for the Wiki. You can use it to write down your research question, hypothesis, and methods, and those sorts of things. And you can also use it to point people to important places in your study. Right now, I'm going to use it to record important study information so that over time, once I start collecting data, I can update this part of my project, and the changes to my project will be automatically tracked because of the version control that's built into the Wiki. So for example, I'm going to put in my research question. My research question for this study is, what is the relationship between soil, weather, management, and crop variables in an intensive experimental cropping system? So all of the text that you put in here is formatting using Markdown, which is a commonly used language. And if you know how to use Markdown, you can easily use it to create very advanced formatting options inside the Wiki. But if you don't know how to use Markdown, you can simply use these buttons above to add the formatting that you need. So for example, I just use the button to bold this top section. So once I'm finished editing, I click Save. And you can see here what I entered. Now, if I want to go back and edit this, say for example, I'm going to put in, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to put in There we go, a header. I can do that, and I can make a change, and I can save it, and then I can take advantage of this, with this compare tab, of the version control to look back on the changes and see who made the changes and when and what changes were made. So this is a great way of retracing project history over time. Are there any questions about the wiki at this point? Okay. So currently we have a project that is starting to have a bit of information to help people make sense of it. But it's also a very flat project right now. There's no structure. So in order to add some structure, to organize similar files together, for example, we would create components. So components, if you create a component, this is creating an independent but nested section of your project that you can use to group similar files together. For example, you might create a component to hold your data. When you pick these categories, this assigns an icon to the component, but it doesn't affect the functionality in any way. If you're an administrator on your project, you'll be given the option to grandfather down the contributors from the project above to the nested component below. So for example, if I click this box, it will automatically add Jolene at read-write permissions to this nested component. However, each component can have its own contributors, and in this case, I'm going to leave Jolene off the contributors list because the data is sensitive. So when you're adding components, when you're thinking about how you're going to organize your project, one thing to think about is what project materials you're going to create that you can share in the future, and which project materials you're going to create that you can't share because they're proprietary or they're sensitive in some way. So I'm not going to share my data because it's sensitive at this point, but I also am going to create a lot of code as part of my analysis in this project. And Jolene, I want to be added to that section of the project. So when you do that, when you add someone, it will check with you to make sure that you are okay with these grandfathered settings to be added to this component. So I am okay with this. So I'm going to go back up to my project level. And now you'll see that I have two sections in this project. I have one that I'm the contributor on, and I have one that both Jolene and I are the contributor on. So each subsection that you create in your project using a new component has its own privacy settings and has its own access settings through the contributors settings here. So it allows you to have a lot of control over who can access which parts of your study materials. Another component I'm going to create is my materials component, which Jolene can also be added to. An important thing to realize is that you can give each of your contributors different permissions for each level of their, for each component that you create in your project. So for example, Jolene has read and write access to one of the other components, but for this component, she actually only needs to have read access. So I'm going to give her read access to this one.
There is a question of Marcus. He is asking, can you show the selection list for components again?
Show the selection list for, okay, yes, absolutely. So when you create a new component, say we're going to create one here for publications. These categories here As you can see, there's a list of common categories, although we don't have an exhaustive list. And these categories are simply a way of assigning an icon that makes it easy to visually distinguish one component from another. However, they don't affect the functionality of the component at all. So if you don't see the category here that you that would suit the sort of material you're going to store in that component, you can always leave it uncategorized. Any questions about the categories? No problem. Okay, and we have a question about images and photos. So maybe you can follow, okay, no option for images. We could consider an image to be data in many cases. You can put any file type in any of these components. It's the categories are simply a label, but you can actually put in anything, including images, into any of these categories of components. So often there is confusion around the categorization, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. It is just a picture that's associated with the component, and it doesn't affect the functionality of it. So you can upload images in the data, you could upload images in the code, the materials, any section that you want, and you could name a component images, for example, and then store all your images there if you would like. Okay? So if you are creating a project in preparation for data collection, when you get to this stage and you created some structure in preparation for your data collection, I'd like to encourage you to consider trying out pre-registration. So for those of you that have never, are not familiar with pre-registration, what pre-registration is a read-only, time-stamped, permanent public version of your study at the state before data collection. All pre-registrations become public eventually, though they can be embargoed, for example, until your published report is released. And you can think of pre-registration as a spectrum. The purpose is to share some important study information about your study before you gathered and looked at your data. And this allows people to know what you planned on doing before you had your data collected, and this allows them to assess how your study changed and what changes might have been data-dependent changes, which is important for interpreting the final results. So a very simple version of pre-registration would just be to answer some very simple study plan information and then to register that information on the OSF. But if you're interested in doing a very complete pre-registration, we currently have an initiative that you might be interested in called the Pre-Registration Challenge. So the Pre-Registration Challenge is an incentive for people to try out pre-registration. So if you pre-register using our template on the Open Science Framework and then publish in an eligible journal, we will give you $1,000. So if you're interested in learning more about this, I would really encourage you to get in touch. It's a really great way to try it out for the first time. So pre-registering the state of your study before you collect your data will improve the transparency of your research, and it also increases accountability in science in general. It makes sure that people are reporting at the end all the things that they measured, so that they're not just reporting the positive, exciting findings, which can introduce bias into our literature. So I'll show you an example of doing a pre-registration here. If any of you are following along, I would like to suggest that you do not follow along in this part, because all of these registrations that you make of a study on the OSF, they're permanent. So we are trying to avoid there being too many test registrations, so that it doesn't clutter up the data that we have. So I have created here a protocol for my study. And if I want to create a pre-registration, I will upload that material here into my materials component. I can do that through my project page by highlighting OSF storage and uploading the information. So this is my protocol that I'm uploading here. I can also drag and drop things into OSF storage. So other materials I have in advance of collecting my data is my code. So I've already written out my analysis code. So that makes it easy for people to know how I planned on doing my analysis in advance. And that makes it easy for them to know what changes I've made over time. And that documents the life cycle of my study and improves the transparency of my research. So I'm going to drag and drop my code into the OSF storage. You can see here it's uploading all of that. And now I have my project ready to collect data. So I'm going to just, before I do that, I'm going to pre-register my project. So I do that by clicking New Registration. I'm going to use an open-ended registration, which allows me to pick what sort of metadata I want to accompany my project. But you can also use the pre-reg challenge at this point, which will guide you through the information that you should include in a pre-registration and make you eligible for the prize. So when you're putting in some information in the summary draft registration, this should be information that allows people to distinguish this registration from other registrations. So it's important to talk about the state of your study when you're registering. So this is my project before data collection. You can put whatever information you think is helpful here. That's your choice. And then I click register. And this is where I can choose to embargo my registration. So I can choose to delay when the registration becomes public by picking an end date here for up to 4 years into the future. But I'm going to choose to make it public immediately because there's no sensitive information. So now all the contributors here will receive an email letting them know that I've tried to register this project, and the people on my team will have the option to veto that registration if they don't think it's ready. But otherwise, if no one vetoes it, this registration will become public. Any questions about registration? I would like to show you an example of what a registration looks like. This is a pre-registration of a study, and you can see information such as when it was registered right down to the minute. So this allows people, when you share your registration, say in your publication in the future, this allows people to know exactly what the state of your project was at this point in time. And they know that this, if you're doing a hypothesis testing question or research, then they know that this was what you planned to do and you didn't change it based on the data, which can introduce bias into your research.
We have a question
you'll also
of Marcus.
Notice. Oh yeah, here we go.
Okay,
Marcus
is
like a data
asking.
Management plan.
Yes. Might be useful to use OSF instead of Zenodo, for example. Or is OSF not meant as a research data repository?
Oh, it is. You can use the OSF as a research data repository. We register our individual institutional project. Okay, so there's two questions here. So we'll start with Marcus. Marcus is talking about how a registration could be. You could register your data management plan. That's one way of putting some more transparency into your project. A registration is a snapshot of your project. So the content of it is dependent on what information you have in your project. So that can include your plans for data management, and it also allows people to have some insight into how you're managing your data because you're sharing that. Might be useful to use the OSF instead of Zenodo. So I could talk to Marcus later about the differences and similarities between Zenodo and the OSF. But the short answer to your question is the OSF is a research data repository. You could use it for that purpose. You can get a DOI for a registration, and that includes a registration of a data set. And so you can use it as a place to store your data. We have a preservation fund to ensure that these materials remain available even if the Center for Open Science is no longer functioning. So it can be used that way. Can we register our individual institutional project? Yes. You can register any project you want. You can create as many registrations as you want. Just remember that they're all going to be public and that they're all permanent. So it's a great way of tracking important stages in the life cycle of your research, such as before data collection or at the point of publication. And this allows you to create a read-only version of your project so that you can continue to update your project. It's a living place for you to keep your research alive, but still mark the important parts and share those parts with the research community. So we're now at 10:42. I'd like to show you how to share, how to add files, use version control, and then share your project. So sometime back, sorry, I'm looking at a question now. Sometime back, I've deposited my PhD data on the OSF. Oh, that's great. So if everybody, anyone who's interested to see another real life example of the OSF, click on that link from Sridhar and he'll show you his PhD data. That's awesome. So any of the files that you store on the OSF storage are tracked using version control. So version control allows you to track all the changes in your files. It also makes it very simple to easily find the most recent version of your folder, of your file. And this is especially important in a collaborative environment where people are using different research services, they are emailing different versions of the file around, and it can be really difficult to remember which is the most recent version. And it can also, using version control can help reduce conflicts. So if one person is editing a file and another person is putting other edits in the same file, that can become very confusing, especially with a large group. So there's two ways of using version control in the OSF. One is with text files such as RScript files, .txt files, or CSV files. You can actually edit those files by clicking this edit toggle here when you're in the file itself. So if you're going to edit a file, the first thing you would do is to check it out. This makes sure that the other people in your team know that you're editing it, and it prevents them from accidentally editing, deleting, or uploading new versions while you're editing, which can really reduce conflicts in your file. So you check out the file, then you can create whatever edit you like and save it. And when you save it, you're creating a new version of this file. And when you're finished editing, you would check it back in so that other people can now continue to add their edits to the file. And all of these changes will be tracked. And you can view what versions were made, who made them, when they're made. You can download previous versions, and you can also view them. But when someone wants to access this version of the file, they're going to see the most previous version when they click on this file. For example, when you see that file here, you'll only see one file, even though all of the versions have been stored here and saved. You'll also notice that every file will have its own global unique identifier, just as every component has its own global unique identifier, and every project will have its own global unique identifier, as well as every registration will have its own global unique identifier. So having all of these unique identifiers allows people to share exactly which part of the project they want to share with someone and point them directly to the part that they want to share with them. So you can, for example, put these identifiers, here, let me show you. If you wanted to point somebody just to the code section of your project, you would simply share this URL with them. And in the wiki, you can create almost a table of contents by putting those links, embedding them here in the wiki. And making it really easy for people to find the things that you want them to find. And if you're going to use version control for non-text files, what you would do is you would edit that file and upload it to the same place with the same name. So you would edit it on your computer. Right now I'm going to edit this protocol document, save it to the same name, and then drag and drop it into the same place as the original one. And then the OSF storage will know that I'm uploading a new version. So you'll be able to, when you view this file, you will be taken to the most recent version, but you can also view all the previous versions here. Any questions about version control in the OSF? One of the other strengths of the Open Science Framework is its ability to centralize the workflows of all the people on your team and connect those workflows together. So that makes it easy to document everything that's going on in your project by using the version control and by allowing there to be one place where you'll find all your materials. And the way that we do this is by using add-ons. So add-ons are a way of integrating the research services that you're already using, such as Amazon, Box, Dataverse, Dropbox. All of these that are listed here are integrated with the Open Science Framework. And we have many more of these add-ons coming down the pipeline. Please get in touch if there's a certain service you use a lot that you would love to see added to this list. So what you do when you create an add-on is you are linking a particular folder or account with your OSF project. So for example, GitHub is a commonly used research service for controlling versions of code. So I have lots of files already on GitHub, and I don't want to stop using GitHub. So instead of having two places for all of my research materials, I can connect my GitHub account with my OSF account, and that way I can access all of my GitHub files through the OSF, and I can also access them through GitHub. And any changes I make in either place will be reflected here in the OSF project. So I'll import the credentials of my project and link a particular GitHub, they call them repos, but for those that are familiar, it's just a folder. And now this repo is linked with my project, and any of my contributors, in this case Jolene, can now see all of those files. I'll show you what it looks like. They'll be able to see all those files here in the file tree. And any edits that I make here to these files through the OSF will be reflected in my GitHub repo and vice versa. So for example, I can create an edit here, save it, and now that change has been pushed to my GitHub repo, and I can see all of those revisions here, just as I showed you before. Creating a project on the OSF makes it very easy to share those parts of your research that you can share in one click of a button, but also keep those parts of your research that you can't share because they're sensitive or you need to keep them private for some reason. You have control by creating these separate components in your project. So I'll show you how that works. I've decided that now I'm ready to share my research. So I click the Make Public button. It'll give me a warning, and then I will get to pick which parts of my project to make public and which will remain private. So I can share my code, my materials, and my publications while leaving the data component private. And then any of you can now come to this GUID and you will see this project, but you will not be able to see into the data component or the name of the data component. But you will be able to access those parts of my project that I did make public, and that can allow me to improve the visibility of my research. Now people can access my code and they can cite my code. Google will scour all of these public projects and make them easily discoverable by the public. So just to show an example of this, this is a researcher that uses the OSF to provide additional materials alongside his open access publications. As you can see here, he has 334 citations with this article, but he also has an OSF project that shows up when you search Google for his research. And when you view on this analytics tab that you can use to measure the impact and reach of your work, you can see that by sharing his research publicly online, he is able to get some information about who is accessing his research, how much time they're spending there, and how they found his research. It also allows him to see how many times his supporting materials have been downloaded, and this paper of his has been downloaded. So this is over 1,800 downloads of this paper that only has 300 citations. So by sharing your material, you're not only becoming more transparent, but you're increasing the opportunity for other people to reuse your material, give you credit for all the work that you're doing, and gives you concrete measures of your impact beyond just citations.